Yo, everybody. Hey, welcome to this video where we're going to talk about action properties default values. We're going to see how you can use them, you can fall back on them, you can set up strict contracts between your component and your app. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's get into it. All right, just a little bit about me. Again, my name is David Warner. I run a blog and YouTube site, warner.digital, work for Quisitive. I'm an MVP, I'm an MCT, but most importantly, I am the biggest fan of all of you in the community. I love working with you, love working on programs like the Rekognition program and Sharing is Caring. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't be shy. Let's collaborate together. Let's get more involved in some community conversations and collaborations, and look forward to working with each and every one of you. All right, so what is on our agenda for today's video? We're going to talk about default values overview and documentation, so I'll give a little bit of overview on that, and then specifically to action default values because they are independent from, say, data properties. They act a little differently. Then we're going to get into a demo specifically around action properties and how you can use those default values. First things first, the documentation here on the left. What you see here on the left, this is literally the entire documentation for default values. So it's a little light, and that's okay. It's an opportunity for us to kind of explore and discover what's capable. I'm not going to read it all to you. You can pause it if you'd like and read it, but pretty basic information it provides. So if we move over to the right and look at the key benefits, what are some of the things that we want to look out for if this was translated into benefits? Well, it's required and optional contracts between the component and the app. And what does that mean, required and optional? We'll talk about that. Don't worry. It's depending on the type of property you're using. It provides fallback values when no input is given. So if you're not making it a required value on your property or parameter, then you could have a fallback. But it also ensures consistent behavior across your component instances, can help establish clear data schema. So for example, if you're using records and you've got very specific data in your record that you need, it provides that clarity, which is super valuable. And then it simplifies user interactions by, again, setting that expectation of values up front. Now, one thing to think about is when you're passing values and you've got default values already in place, for example, within your component, you can fall back to those. So if no value is provided, you can fall back to them. But if you do provide anything, like for example, if you've got a record that's got 5 different key value pairs in them and you only provide 2, it's not going to fall back to the 3 you didn't, right? So it's kind of an all or nothing package. So think about that. And then it must obviously comply with the data type or the return data type of the property. So if you set up your property to be of type record, which we'll see in this demo, then it's going to expect a record. You try to pass it just plain text or an image or something like that, it's going to give you some grief and tell you, no, sorry, I'm waiting for something else and it's a record. So again, those are hard and fast requirements, which are actually very, very good, right? Make sure that your component is getting the data it's expecting. Okay, so with action properties, there are some key benefits. Unlike data properties, if you've already watched that video, you would have seen that there's a kind of sort of maybe contract. Now, if you haven't watched it, maybe go watch it or watch it after this, not dependent on one another, but those do have a kind of sort of maybe contract. It's a little loose. Action properties are more strict. They are required. When you set up a specific contract of default data inside of your component for an action property, you have to supply that data. So for example, if you are going to supply a record, you have to supply all of the key value properties for that record. In data, the data properties, not necessarily as strict. In the case of action properties, it's very, very strict. So that's in place. And these default values are most useful when coupled with action property parameters. You'll see why in the demo, but you're going to probably more realistically want to use them with parameters. Now, some key factors to consider: the default values can be referenced in data if return data type is used, right? So you could use both of those, and we'll see how that works. And then function properties of type output use default values in the same way, right? So action properties and function properties of type output are kind of like siblings or cousins or whatever. They just simply, action properties are more robust, right? Because they can allow you to select a button or reset or have behavior or expression chaining, just more powerful. Functions are kind of black box, but they do act the same way when it comes to default values. Okay, so what's our demo going to look like? We're going to continue using these badges. That's been the theme kind of throughout this series. So we're going to create an action property with defined default data of type record. And that record is going to be information about the badges. We're going to focus on the May the 4th badges. And then, as we'll see, that maybe doesn't work for us, we're going to create a parameter that's then going to use defined default data of type record. That's where the really coolness starts to work. And then we're going to enforce the default data requirements when executing the action property inside of the app. We're going to see how that enforcement is going to be required and all that stuff. And we'll see how it looks when it's optional, cover a robust spectrum of how to use the default data in this demo. So looking forward to it. Let's jump into the studio and see you live. Okay, so I'm here in Power Apps inside of a component in a component library. Let me just show you a little pre-setup that I've done. I've already created a component here for my default values, specifically for action properties. And then I've created a screen for that, right? And I've already added the default or the component to that, renamed it just to make it a little easier to reference when I do inside my app. So first things first, we're gonna come over and create a new custom property. I'm gonna call it action record property. And I'm going to set the property type to action. I'm going to leave the return data type to none for now, and we'll just click create. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and add a default value to this. Get out of here. Let's do that. So we've got a default value using badge name, badge URL, and total badges earned, just some custom data about our recognition program. This badge URL references the image of the badge. All right, so now as a refresher, remember an action property allows us to essentially execute functionality within the component from the app side, right? So normally you'd click a button within a component, but maybe there's functionality tied to that button. So you want to hide the component and you want to expose that functionality to the app. You can do that with an action property. Now you don't have to use a button. You could put anything you want. In fact, there doesn't even have to be anything on the component side that invokes that functionality. You can just simply include something or functionality within your action property, and then the app can invoke that. So that's what we're going to do. Right now I've got my default values. I'm going to go back over to this screen, which is emulation, and I'm just going to insert a button, right? And we'll just move that down here. We'll zoom in and we'll just call this button action button. Okay. So now when I go to the on select, the way I reference my property is I reference the component. All right. So in this case, action defaults comp, that's the name that I gave it. All right. So I can reference that action defaults comp dot, and then I can do action record property dot. Okay. So wait a second. It's a function. Okay. So that's right. So that actually will execute that function, but all the function has is a record. So, and the return type is none. So really, where do those defaults kind of come into play? It's kind of confusing. Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to have defaults inside of your action property, at least without a return type. Remember, our return type is none. So where do we use those? Well, this is actually where using your default values inside of an action and a function of type output, for example, which is also the same thing as an action, just more limited. The action allows you to reset and select, do expression chaining and stuff like that, right? But the parameter and putting the default values in the parameter is where it makes the most sense. So let's go take a look. Now, before I do that, I am going to just remove the reference here. It'll error if we don't, because we're going to add a parameter, and that parameter is going to be required, and we're not passing it there, so it's going to error. Just going to remove it for now. So I'm going to go back to my component. I'm going to go back into my property, and I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to create a new parameter. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to give the parameter a name of param action required. And then inside of my description, I'm going to add this record expected, just a simple little text string that kind of gives an idea. You'll see why, it'll make sense in a moment. And then I'm going to change the data type to record. I'm going to leave it required. I'm going to say create, and I'm going to hit save. Now it's going to tell me, are you sure you want to update the action record? This may cause errors on the controls you depend on it. That's fine. Usually what happens is when you make changes to a property, by the way, depending on if you're changing the actual property value or the parameter value, it'll get rid of whatever you have in there. So you want to maybe copy out whatever you've created just in case it gets rid of. If you've created something lengthy, then you're going to be like, don't, it's going to be really, really, really bad. You don't want that, right? So I'm going to say, okay, it's not going to do it because it's a brand new parameter for me. But what I do want to do is I want to go over and you can access the parameter. It's always off of the properties drop down here, and it's always indented right off of your property. So that's the parameter, that's my property, and I can go over to that. And what it's done is it's created for me this simple string. We've seen it in other places, right? Whenever you create a record, it's going to create a default value. It's always going to say sample string field and number field and Boolean field, and it's going to give you some values. So I want to replace that with my values, badge name, badge URL, which leads to an image, and total badges earned. Okay, so now I've done that. I'm setting the default for that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the app. I'm going to go back into my buttons on select. And now I'm going to reference the action defaults comp again, dot, and then I'm going to come to my record property. And now what happens is I open it up and it's like, okay, you have a parameter that's required. This is why I said add that description, because unless you add a description that defines what kind of data type it is, you're kind of leaving your app maker guessing, right? You ideally want to document it somewhere, it would be great. But if you haven't, this at least gives them a head up that, hey, there's a record expected. So that heads up can kind of help. And what's even cooler is when you first type that open curly brace, then you actually get some IntelliSense, right? So if I do this, now it shows, okay, here are the values that it is expecting you to supply: a badge name, a badge URL, right? Let's do that again. Badge name, badge URL, total badges earned. So I'm just going to open this up a little wider, deeper here, right? And I'm going to add that and do that. I just pasted it in, format it, a little easier to look at. Okay, so now what's happening is I am now able to pass in, and I'm identifying that that is the default values that are required, and I'm able to display that. The IntelliSense helps. Really, really, really cool. And so now that we've set this up, you might be wondering, well, I remember you set the parameter to required, which means that we have to pass something in. But is the schema required? Is the record required? Right? What if we try to pass in a text value or something like that? Well, let's take a look. If I just copy this so that I can paste it, I'll just cut it out, and I'll just do this test, right? We see an error, and that error is, hey, we're expecting a record, right? Invalid argument type text, it recognizes text, expecting a record value instead, right? So same thing, if I do sample image, hover over it, hey, I see that's an image, it's not a record, I'm expecting a record. Okay, so that's step one, that's good. Two, if I put this back in and then I take one of these items out, right? Okay, well, what's that error? Okay, so it says invalid argument type, expecting a record value. So it's like, hey, congratulations, you tried, but still failed. But a different schema. And of course, we know what the schema is because it showed it to us when we put the open curly brace, which is kind of cool. Now, this is different from data properties, right? If you haven't watched that video, I recommend it. I'll include a link here. In data properties, it allows us to pass a schema, but it doesn't seem to enforce the full schema. Here, inside of the action, as well as the output function, which are kind of cousins, as well as the input function and events, they're a little bit more strict. They absolutely require you to include the full schema. You have to include the full schema or it's going to fail. So I'll paste that back in and we see it's now satisfying and it's working. And so now remember what we're trying to do is we're generating the parameter values here inside of the app, right? So we're inside the screen, we're in the app, we're executing that function inside of our app, which is a function that lives inside the component. So we're passing this information in. So the concept then is that inside of the component, it would receive this data. So let's go back to the component. We'll go into our property. Right now we're in the parameter. So we'll go into our property, which still has that default value we pasted in originally. So we don't need it. We can just delete it. And now what we want to do is we want to receive that data. We want to get that data back that's being passed in. So the way you could do that is you could reference the parameter. Right, so in this case, what we want to do is we want to get the value, that record back from the app, and we want to go and use that URL image value or property value and set it to an image here in our our component, right? So to do that, I can't just pass that directly to the image. I can't reference the parameter value directly to the image. You can only reference those parameter values inside of the component itself. So what I need to do is I'm going to set a variable. I'm just going to say set image badge URL. And then what you normally feel like you would do is you'd reference the actual component here, and then reference the output, right? Or excuse me, the action property. So if I said default action props dot, and then, oh, well, hold on, it's not showing up there, right? Well, it's not showing up because you don't reference it within that. But what you do is you reference the parameter name itself, right? So the parameter name was param action record. So now I can reference that. I can now reference the record values, the items and the properties and all that. So now I can say badge URL and do that. And now if I hover over and select that, we can see, okay, yeah, it's type text. Now remember, it is string, it will become an image, obviously. So what I can do is now I can insert an image. So I'm just going to remember I'm in the component still. So I'm going to insert an image. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that image property equal to badge. Right now it's text, of course, it's gonna show up. So now to make that work, what I do is I go back into the screen and I'll hold down the Alt button to simulate that I'm in preview or play mode. And when I click that, well, sure enough, right? What's happening is that button is being activated. So it's calling the action property up here. It's passing in this value. The action property inside the component receives that value. It takes the URL string, it sets it equal to the variable, and then that variable is displayed here in the image, right? So now I'm able to request essentially default values from my default schema expected values from my app maker. That gets provided in the form of a parameter, and then I'm able to use that and do something with it inside the component. Now, you easily could have set up separate properties for each one of those values. We could have absolutely set up a name property, a URL property, a variable or a numeric property. Absolutely could have done all those things. But in this case, it's a little easier, right? What if we are passing in a bunch of data in the form of records or tables? We could have done a table type as the data type. It just creates a little bit more efficiency, and then you can use that information and pass it around inside your component. So it's very malleable. That's the thing I love about these components. They're very liquid, very Gumby-like, right? Bendable, bendable. You can do whatever you want with them, and you can find more efficient ways to use them. So it's also worth noting that when we talk about default values, usually you think, well, default values are the default value. If we don't supply anything, what's going to be the default value? It's going to be whatever you defined as the default value, right? In this case, we set the parameter to be required. And so we had to supply something. But what if we set the parameter to not be required and it never passed anything? Well, at that point, it will use the default values, right? So here we're using the same image as the default value. So I'm going to change that. I'm just going to come here and I'm going to put in a different image. And so now when I click action, we see may the open source be with you. That's what I'm passing in. That's what's being displayed. But what if I went back into my component and I went into my property and I went into the parameter, and instead of making it required, we make it optional. So I'm going to click that. I'm going to save it. Yep, it's going to give me that warning. Everything's going to save. It's okay because I'm not really changing the record or data type. When you change the data type is when it really erases things. So that's fine. It's no longer required and our image has gone away, and that's fine. I go back here, it's gone away too. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove that parameter in totality, right? So we've got that now. Okay, so what do you think is going to happen when I click the action button? What should happen is it should fall back to the original the fork awakens, because that's what our default value was. So if I close that and click that, sure enough, right, there is our fork awakens, because it's falling back to the default value. So while we've showed all the cool ways to use default values to instantiate or set up a contract, if you will, an actual real contract and data type and schema and everything between your app and your component, you can use the default values as the fallback as well if nothing is passed. So keep that in mind if you're using default values. It's kind of multifaceted. They're multidimensional. You can use them to set up that contract, but they're also, you can fall back, right? Super, super useful. Now, what we haven't done is we haven't really talked about return types. When we set up our property, we set it up as a return type of none. So if you use a return type, the key is that it's like a round trip. So in this case, the instantiation of the action property kind of starts, if you will, in the app. The app sends a request to the component. The component does whatever is defined inside the action property function. If you use a return type of none, that's the end of the story. One-way trip. But if you use a return data type, there's a second leg to that trip, goes round trip back to the app, right? So you can then construct your function, your action property function, to return data back into the app. So let's see how that would look like if we were to now change this to utilize a return type. So to do that, we want to go back into our component, and we're going to come back into our output property for action type. And here we're just going to change our return type to a record. Now, when I do that, it's going to get rid of this value, right? So because I mentioned we're changing the actual return data type, this is where it will really get rid of everything. So I want to make sure that I copy that out and just watch up there. When I hit save, it's going to warn me, yep, it's replaced it. Now, of course, we got some errors. Of course, that's fine. We'll get back to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to replace that. I'm going to add in my original that I had set up. That's fine. And I'm also going to now replace this with what I've been using as my schema here. Okay, so now what we're doing is returning data. Now, if I got rid of this, because I'm using a return type, it does expect that, right? We see it's erroring and it says expected record value. That is because something is expected to return back to the app. I'm inside my component, it's going to do this functionality, and then it needs to return something back to the app. Now, at this point, it doesn't have to be the same data schema, right? I could absolutely do test value, and that's perfectly fine, right? It doesn't have to be the same schema or even data type that was set up in my parameter. Don't get me wrong; those are not absolutely connected or related or enforced here. I'm just going to use the same thing for purposes of simplicity, so we're kind of talking about the same sort of data. But keep in mind, you can return anything you want. So in this case, I've got my badge name, my badge URL to the image, and my total badges earned. So now that's being returned back to my app. So let's go back to the app and take a look at how we can utilize those values. And actually, before we go back over to the app, I do just want to make a modification to the badge name here. We'll just call it return data. So that way, when we reference it, we know it's not what was passed into the action property, but actually is separate from that. We're hard coding it here as a return value, return data, and passing it back. So that way we know it's different. Now, I also want to reference that I'm using hard coded values here. You absolutely could use dynamic values. You don't have to use hard coded values, just using them for simplicity of the demo, but bear in mind, you could make them dynamic, no problem. Okay, so I'm going to come back over into my screen, and where we're referencing our actual property here now, we want to take advantage of this. Now, I had set this up as the parameter is not required. So when I click the action button, we see our Fork Awakens image up there. Let me move that down, actually. Okay, cool. And so I can see that there. Let me go back to my button. Of course I can do that. There we go. I go back to my button. So how do I get that return type, right? Well, I've got a whole nother video that goes all over the return types. So I'm not going to get too into detail on how to do it necessarily in the details around it, but it does require us setting a variable. So I'm going to say return data var. We'll just leave it at that. And then I'm going to execute that and like that, right? So now what happens is when I hover over that return data var variable, we can see, okay, it sees it as a record. Right, cool, okay. So then I can reference that return type. So what I'm gonna do is I am going to say return data var dot, and now I'm able to access that data, that record. Right, and so that information is there, and even though I didn't pass anything in, right? Because it's hard-coded, I hard-coded the value, I can reference the badge name. And so I'll just do a notify to that, right? And so now when I click that button, we see the Fork Awakens return data, right? So pretty cool, but that's not really default data, right? I mean, it's the default data that's being returned. I'm hard-coding it. But what if I were to change the value here to the actual value of the action property, right? The parameter. So in here, I'm going to say param action required dot badge name. Okay, so now what's happening is the data is coming in to the component from my app via the parameter. But in this case, what did we do? We set the parameter up to not be required. So I'm technically not passing anything in to my component. So what's going to get passed back to my app as the return type? Well, in this case, it is actually the default value. So when I come back here, if we go look at the default value for that parameter, right over here, it's the Fork Awakens. It's no longer the Fork Awakens return data. So if I come back over to my screen here and I hit the action button, what should happen is because we're not passing any values in here, it's going to fall back. The notify is going to be the value from our default data, right? The Fork Awakens. It's no longer return data because it's falling back to the return or to the default value of our parameter. So a lot of moving pieces, right? All these things are connected to one another. We can use them. So in this case, we're using a return data. But that return data is actually relying on default values of a parameter. So you can see how they're kind of twisted together and working together, but in a super cool way, super powerful. Just rewatch the video if you need to. It may be a little hard to get your head wrapped around. I know I played with this quite a bit to kind of figure it all out because not all the documentation is super detailed, and that's okay. It's really cool to play with. But go in, play with it, check it out, leave some comments in the comment section here in the video and YouTube. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have ideas on how you're using some of this. Would love to collaborate with you. Give me a like and subscribe as well so I can keep creating this kind of content for you. Really love all the feedback I'm getting from you. Let me know how I can help. If you've got ideas for other videos you would like to see, let me know. I love components. I really enjoy component libraries and the cool stuff around them. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you in the next one.